I never imagined that a heated walkway could turn my quiet street into a nightmare. But that's exactly what happened during the worst blizzard Pine Hollow, Colorado had seen in decades. The snow was coming down so fast it felt like the sky was trying to bury us alive. Wind howled through the neighborhood. Ice coated every surface, and visibility was almost zero. Inside our home, my wife, Elaine Carter, was struggling to breathe. She depends on an oxygen tank and a mobility walker. For her, ice isn't just dangerous, it can be fatal. That's why I had installed a heated walkway from our front door to the driveway, fully permitted, fully inspected, approved without issue. Then, right as the storm hit its peak, HOA President Cynthia Harlow marched up to my door in the freezing wind and started yelling that my walkway was a violation of community standards. She ordered me to shut it off immediately. I said no. That's when she threatened fines, liens on my home, and even the police, all while my wife stood behind me, gasping for air. And then she said the words, "I'll never forget, your personal medical problems don't override HOA authority." In that moment, I realized this was never about concrete or snow. It was about power. And just minutes after she tried to ban the one thing keeping my wife safe, I discovered something buried under our neighborhood that would shut her entire HOA down. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My name is Daniel Carter, and for more than 3 decades I worked as a municipal utilities inspector. I spent my career reviewing water systems, permits, pressure maps, infrastructure compliance reports, and the kind of paperwork most people never think about until something goes wrong. I retired thinking that part of my life was behind me. I never expected those skills would end up protecting my own family. My wife, Elaine, has severe respiratory issues. She relies on an oxygen tank daily and uses a mobility walker to get around. A few winters ago, before we installed the heated walkway, she slipped on black ice right outside our front door. I can still remember the sound of her hitting the ground and the panic in her eyes as she tried to breathe in freezing air. By the time help arrived, she was hypothermic and dangerously low on oxygen. The doctor told me plainly that if she had been out there any longer, she might not have survived. That was the moment I decided never to gamble with winter again. I did everything by the book. I hired licensed contractors, submitted permits, paid inspection fees, and passed every required check. The heated walkway wasn't flashy. It wasn't oversized. It was practical, subtle, and designed for one purpose: to keep my wife alive. The HOA approved it without hesitation. Inspectors signed off. Everyone smiled and moved on. At least, that's what I thought. We live in Pine Hollow Ridge, an upscale development built years ago on what used to be farmland. It's the kind of neighborhood real estate listings describe as peaceful and well-maintained. Trimmed lawns, neutral paint colors, decorative mailboxes that all match. On the surface, it looks perfect. That image was largely shaped by Cynthia Harlow, the HOA president. When she first ran for the board, she campaigned on promises of order, property values, and uniformity. She talked a lot about protecting investments and keeping the neighborhood clean. People liked her confidence. They liked that she sounded decisive. Over time, she consolidated power, rewrote procedures, and positioned herself as the final word on what was acceptable in Pine Hollow Ridge. For a while, none of that affected us, until the blizzard. Within days of Cynthia confronting me at my door, the notices started arriving. Official-looking envelopes. Legal language. Bolded warnings. First came a temporary violation notice, claiming my walkway created an unapproved visual deviation. That was followed by a fine. Then another letter warning of escalating penalties if I didn't comply. Each notice referenced rules I had never seen before. Then I noticed something strange. The HOA bylaws had been clarified. That was the word they used. Clarified. Not changed, not amended, clarified. New language suddenly appeared about exterior heating elements, aesthetic consistency, and energy usage, all dated after my installation but written as if they had always existed. I knew better. In my old job, backdating documents was one of the first red flags of misconduct. Rules don't quietly appear overnight unless someone wants to pretend they were always there. As the letters piled up, I started paying attention to who else Cynthia was targeting. It didn't take long to see a pattern. A neighbor down the street with a disabled son was cited for having a temporary ramp. An elderly man across the corner was fined repeatedly for a bird feeder because it was unsightly. A family with a child in physical therapy was warned about visible medical equipment in their garage. Every single one of them shared something in common. They were vulnerable. They were slower to fight back, less likely to hire lawyers, less able to attend long meetings or sift through pages of HOA paperwork. Cynthia never went after the loud families, the wealthy couples, or the people with connections. She went after the ones who couldn't afford to push back quickly. That's when the realization hit me hard. This wasn't about enforcing rules evenly. This HOA wasn't trying to protect the neighborhood. It was selecting targets. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The heated walkway wasn't the problem. It was just the excuse. The real issue was that my wife's needs didn't fit Cynthia's idea of perfection. And, in her world, anything that disrupted her version of control had to be eliminated. That's when I stopped asking myself how to make the HOA happy, and started asking myself who else had already been hurt and what Cynthia might be hiding to keep her power intact. After the blizzard, the pressure didn't ease up. It multiplied. Cynthia didn't wait for clear weather or reasonable hours. She sent HOA compliance officers during active snowstorms, clipboards tucked under their coats, snapping photos while ice was still falling from the sky. More than once, I opened my door to find a violation notice taped directly over fresh snow, already damp from melting. It felt intentional, like she wanted to remind me that she could reach my front step anytime she wanted. The emails were worse. They came late at night, sometimes just before midnight, always copied to the entire board. Long paragraphs full of legal language, bolded threats, and vague references to ongoing non-compliance. She wrote as if I were some repeat offender instead of a homeowner trying to keep his wife alive. Each message ended the same way: immediate action required or further enforcement would follow. Elaine stopped sleeping through the night. Every knock at the door made her anxious. Every email notification made her flinch. Watching that guilt settle on her shoulders was harder than dealing with Cynthia herself. That's when I decided to stop dealing with this alone. I started talking to my neighbors. Quietly at first. Short conversations by mailboxes, quick chats during rare breaks in the weather. I didn't accuse anyone. I just asked questions, and what I heard made my stomach sink. Walter Griggs, a retired widower in his late 70s, told me he'd been fined repeatedly for hanging bird feeders in his backyard, not on a fence. Not visible from the street, in his backyard. The fines kept increasing until he finally took them down because, in his words, I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. Maria Delgado, who lived 2 streets over, had been forced to remove a temporary wheelchair ramp she used to get her teenage daughter in and out of the house. Cynthia claimed it altered the visual harmony of the neighborhood. Maria said she cried while unbolting it, knowing she'd have to lift her daughter manually again. Then there was the Reynolds families, threatened with daily fines because their son's physical therapy equipment was visible through their open garage. Cynthia called it unsightly storage. They called it necessary medical care. The stories kept coming. Different rules. Same targets. Every person Cynthia went after had a vulnerability. Carriage, disability, medical needs. None of them had lawyers on retainer. None of them had the time or energy to wage a prolonged fight. That's when it clicked. This wasn't random enforcement. It was selective. And selective enforcement is never about rules. It's about power. Once I saw that pattern, my professional instincts kicked in. In my old job, patterns were everything. Infrastructure never fails randomly. Corruption never acts alone. There's always a system behind it. I started paying attention to things most people wouldn't notice. Water pressure. It began as a small curiosity. One morning, our kitchen faucet sputtered briefly before stabilizing. Later that day, a neighbor mentioned low pressure during peak hours. Nothing alarming on its own. But when I walked the neighborhood, I noticed something odd. Pressure differences between streets. Some blocks had consistent, strong flow. Others didn't. And one particular cluster of homes, all near Cynthia's block, had unusually low recorded city water usage despite visible signs of heavy consumption. Green lawns, active sprinklers, clean driveways even during dry spells. That didn't make sense. In municipal systems, low usage usually means either conservation or an alternate source, and these homes were not conserving. I pulled public water usage data, nothing confidential. Just standard consumption averages. The discrepancy became impossible to ignore. Cynthia's side of the neighborhood was using significantly less city water than comparable homes. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't jump to conclusions, but I paid attention. At the next HOA meeting, I decided to ask a simple question. Calm. Neutral. No accusations. I asked whether the HOA had ever commissioned a neighborhood infrastructure review, given the development's age and history as former farmland. Cynthia's response was immediate and sharp. She cut me off mid-sentence. She said infrastructure discussions were outside the scope of HOA concerns. She moved to the next agenda item without allowing follow-up questions. When another neighbor tried to speak, she shut them down too. But for just a moment, barely a second, I saw it on her face. Not anger, not irritation. Fear. Her hands tightened on the podium. Her voice wavered before she forced it steady. She avoided eye contact and rushed the meeting to adjournment. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. People who are merely enforcing rules don't panic when someone asks about water. People who are hiding something do. From that moment on, I understood that the heated walkway was just the opening move. Cynthia didn't care about concrete or aesthetics. She cared about silence. And the moment I started asking the wrong questions, I stopped being a nuisance. I became a threat. This was no longer about harassment or fines. Something was buried under Pine Hollow Ridge. And Cynthia was willing to bully, intimidate, and target the most vulnerable people in the neighborhood to keep it hidden. By the time I realized this wasn't going to stop on its own, I knew I needed help from someone who understood how power gets abused behind polite language. Not an HOA attorney, not a mediator. Someone who dealt with patterns and consequences. That's how I ended up sitting across from Eglina Morales S., a civil rights attorney who specialized in disability accommodation cases. I didn't dramatize anything when I spoke to her. I brought documentation. Emails, violation notices, timelines, photos, dates written out, patterns highlighted. I showed her how my walkway had been approved, inspected, and then retroactively clarified into a violation only after Cynthia decided she didn't like it. Lena barely made it halfway through the file before she leaned back and shook her head. "This isn't enforcement," she said. "This is selective targeting." She explained it plainly. When rules are enforced unevenly, especially against people with disabilities or medical needs, it crosses out of HOA governance and into fair housing violations. The moment accommodations are treated as nuisances instead of necessities, the law gets involved. And from what she could see, Cynthia wasn't just skirting the line, she was sprinting past it. Then Lena asked a question that stopped me cold. "Have you ever looked into who benefits from these rule changes?" I told her I hadn't, not directly. She pulled up a public database on her laptop and turned the screen toward me. Cynthia's husband, she said, tapping the name, Mark Harlow. He sits on the county planning advisory committee. I felt my chest tighten. Lena explained what that meant. Committee members often see permit applications, zoning discussions, and infrastructure proposals before they're public. They know what's coming. They know who's planning renovations, who's requesting accommodations, who might disrupt the status quo. And if your spouse runs the HOA, Lena continued, you can shape the rules to block people before they even know they need protection. Early access, early warnings, early control. Suddenly, the timing of Cynthia's rule, clarifications, made sense. The way new restrictions appeared right when someone needed a ramp, or medical equipment, or, in my case, a heated walkway. This wasn't reactive. It was strategic. Lena advised me to stop engaging emotionally and start documenting everything as if it would one day be read aloud in court. No raised voices, no accusations, just records, patterns, proof. The next HOA meeting came quickly. Cynthia called it with minimal notice, claiming it was urgent. When I arrived, I noticed something new immediately. She wasn't alone. Standing near the sidewall was a young man I hadn't seen before, nervous posture. Cheap clipboard, phone held a little too tightly. Cynthia introduced him as Evan Harlow, her nephew, and announced that he would now serve as the HOA's compliance coordinator. The room went quiet. Nepotism wasn't technically forbidden under the bylaws, but it was frowned upon. Cynthia didn't care. She smiled the way people do when they know they've stacked the deck. Evan spent the meeting recording everything. Every comment, every question. He followed Cynthia closely, jotting notes and occasionally glancing at her for approval. He looked overwhelmed, like someone who'd been handed a role he wasn't ready for. When residents asked about fines, Cynthia shut them down. When someone mentioned accommodations, she redirected. When I raised a procedural question about retroactive rules, she cut me off sharply and moved on. The meeting ended abruptly. As people filtered out, I stayed behind, gathering my papers slowly. That's when I heard raised voices from the hallway. Cynthia was furious. She berated Evan for not standing closer, for not interrupting faster, for letting dangerous questions linger. Her voice echoed, sharp and unfiltered. What she didn't realize was that Evan's phone was still recording. He had forgotten to stop it. Later that night, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. No subject line, just a single audio file attached. I hesitated before opening it. When I pressed play, Cynthia's voice filled the room. She wasn't calm. She wasn't composed. She was panicking. She ranted about residents digging where they shouldn't. She complained that people were connecting dots. She warned Evan never to let anyone talk about permits, water, or infrastructure again. At one point, she snapped, "If they start asking questions, this whole thing falls apart." My hands were shaking by the time the recording ended. This wasn't just evidence of misconduct. It was evidence of fear. Evan followed up with a short message. He didn't defend himself. He didn't ask for money. He just said he didn't want to be dragged into something illegal and thought I should have the recording in case it mattered. It mattered. That audio was the first real crack in Cynthia's armor. Not because it was dramatic, but because it confirmed intent. She knew something was wrong. She knew questions were dangerous, and she was actively trying to suppress them. Up until that point, Cynthia had been untouchable in her own mind. HOA president, rulemaker, authority figure. But now I knew something she didn't expect anyone to hear. She wasn't enforcing order. She was guarding a secret. And from that moment on, I stopped wondering whether I should push back. I started planning how to make sure the truth came out, no matter how hard she tried to bury it. After the recording, something in me shifted. Up until that point, I had been reacting. Answering letters, responding to emails, defending the heated walkway like it was the center of the conflict. That night, I stopped doing that entirely. I didn't shut the walkway off. I didn't argue about aesthetics anymore. I didn't respond to Cynthia's threats because I finally understood something important. The walkway wasn't the problem. It was the distraction. Instead of wasting energy justifying what had already been approved, I went back to what I knew best: infrastructure. In my old job, whenever something didn't add up on the surface, it almost always meant the real issue was buried underground. Literally. I started with public records. No hacking, no favors. Just county archives, old development plans, and environmental impact reports that anyone could request if they knew where to look. Pine Hollow Ridge hadn't always been a neat suburban development. Decades earlier, the land had been farmland, heavily irrigated and dotted with multiple agricultural wells. Wells that, according to the records, were supposed to be permanently sealed when the development was built. "Supposed to be" is a phrase that makes inspectors nervous. I dug deeper. Permit closures, decommissioning certificates, final inspection sign-offs. That's when the gaps appeared. Several wells were listed as sealed, but the documentation was incomplete. No final photographs, no verified pressure tests, no independent environmental confirmation. In my experience, that usually meant one of two things: someone cut corners or someone intentionally left access behind. So I walked the neighborhood. Not as an angry homeowner, as an inspector. I took slow walks down Cynthia's street and the surrounding blocks, paying attention to landscaping, spacing, and symmetry. And that's when I noticed them: decorative covers. Round, identical. Perfectly placed in multiple backyards. Always near where old agricultural wells would have been marked on historical maps. They blended in just well enough that no one would question them. Most people would assume they covered irrigation access or drainage. But I knew better. You don't place identical decorative covers over random spots unless they're hiding something functional. I didn't touch them. I didn't open anything. I didn't accuse anyone. I documented. Photos, locations, measurements, distances from property lines. I compared them to the old maps. They lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. The next HOA meeting was tense before it even started. Cynthia was on edge. I could see it in how tightly she clutched her papers and how quickly she dismissed side conversations. Evan stood off to the side again, phone in hand, looking more nervous than ever. Residents were frustrated. Fines had piled up. People wanted answers. Someone asked about budget discrepancies. Cynthia deflected. Someone asked about sudden rule changes. She brushed it off. Then I asked a simple question. I didn't mention wells. I didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I asked whether the HOA had ever reviewed city water usage trends across the neighborhood to ensure fair billing and infrastructure consistency. For a moment, no one spoke. Cynthia's smile froze. She opened her mouth, closed it, then snapped that water usage was not an HOA matter and ordered the discussion to move on. That's when it happened. Evan shifted uncomfortably. He looked around the room. Then he spoke. Not loudly, not confidently, just honestly. "Why is our family water bill half of everyone else's?" The silence was immediate and absolute. You could hear the hum of the lights overhead. A few people turned slowly toward Cynthia. Others looked at Evan, then back at her. Cynthia's face drained of color. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She didn't even respond at first. Her eyes darted across the room like she was searching for an exit that wasn't there. Finally, she snapped that Evan was confused and that personal billing information was private. She adjourned the meeting early and stormed out, barely acknowledging the board members sitting beside her. But the damage was done. That one question changed everything, because it confirmed what my instincts had been screaming from the beginning. The unusually low water usage, the pressure differences, the decorative covers. The panic Whenever infrastructure was mentioned, it all pointed in the same direction. The heated walkway had never been the real threat. The real danger to Cynthia was that I had stopped arguing about snow and started asking about water. And if an HOA president panics when someone mentions water bills, it's not because of accounting. It's because something illegal is flowing where it shouldn't be. From that moment on, I knew the fight had shifted. This wasn't about winning an HOA dispute anymore. It was about uncovering what Pine Hollow Ridge was really built on and who had been benefiting from it for years. Once Evan asked that question, Cynthia's behavior changed overnight. The emails stopped sounding confident. The violation notices slowed. For the first time since the blizzard, she wasn't charging forward, she was scrambling. That alone told me I was close to something she couldn't control. A few days later, she showed up at my door unannounced. No clipboard. No compliance officer. No audience. Just Cynthia, standing stiffly on my porch, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said she wanted to resolve things quietly. At first, she framed it as generosity. She offered to waive all fines, erase violations, and issue a written exemption for the heated walkway. She even suggested the HOA could reimburse part of the installation cost as a goodwill gesture. I didn't respond. Her smile tightened. She lowered her voice and tried again. This time, she offered cash. She said it wouldn't be documented. She said it would save everyone a lot of stress. She said I could keep my walkway, my privacy, and my peace if I stopped asking questions. I told her no. The next offer came 2 days later. More money. A larger amount. She didn't say the number out loud, but she slid it across the table written on a folded piece of paper. I didn't even need to read it to know it was serious. I pushed it back toward her. That's when the tone shifted. She warned me about legal costs, about how long cases can drag on, about how stressful things can become for someone in my wife's condition. She didn't threaten outright. She didn't have to. The implication was clear. If I didn't stop, she would make life difficult. That meeting ended with her standing up abruptly and telling me I was making a mistake. She was right about one thing. Things were about to get very difficult. But not for me, because by then, I'd already started collecting water samples. I was careful. I followed proper chain of custody procedures. Sterile containers, multiple locations, different times of day, samples from homes on Cynthia's block and from other parts of the neighborhood for comparison. I documented everything like I was still on the job. Then I drove them to Dr. Allison Park, the director of a certified state environmental laboratory I had worked with years earlier. I didn't dramatize anything when I dropped them off. I told her I needed a full panel analysis and asked her to treat it like a routine investigation. She called me herself when the results came back. Her voice was tight. She told me the nitrate levels alone were alarming, far above what's considered safe for drinking water. Then she moved down the list. Pesticide residue from chemicals that hadn't been legally used in decades. Bacterial contamination consistent with stagnant, unmaintained systems. Trace metals leaching from old pipes. This water, she said carefully, should never be consumed, especially not by elderly residents, especially not by children, especially not by anyone with compromised respiratory or immune systems. People like my wife. The realization hit me harder than anything Cynthia had done. This wasn't just fraud or corruption. This was people unknowingly being exposed to something dangerous every single day. People Cynthia had been finding, targeting, silencing, people who trusted the system to keep them safe. Dr. Park asked me where the samples came from. When I explained the history of the land and the sealed wells, she went quiet for a moment. If those wells were never properly decommissioned, she said, this could be a major environmental violation. That's when I called Caleb Stone, an environmental enforcement attorney known for handling cases involving illegal water sources and regulatory cover-ups. I sent him everything, the lab reports, the documentation gaps, the audio recording, the pattern of selective enforcement. He didn't hesitate. "This isn't an HOA issue," he said. "This is a public health crisis." He explained what that meant: multiple agencies, mandatory reporting, state and possibly federal involvement. If the water system was illegally supplying homes, especially without disclosure, the legal consequences would be severe. Suddenly, Cynthia's panic made perfect sense. The walkway wasn't the danger. The danger was that someone who understood systems had started connecting them. Within days, Cynthia tried again. This time, she didn't offer money. She sent a formal letter threatening immediate legal action for harassment and defamation. She accused me of destabilizing the community. She warned that continued behavior would result in serious consequences. I forwarded the letter to Caleb. He replied with one sentence: "Let her keep writing," because every threat, every bribe, every attempt to intimidate wasn't helping her. It was building the case. At that point, the path forward was clear. This had moved far beyond snow, concrete, or HOA bylaws. People's health was at risk. Laws had been broken, and silence was no longer an option. Cynthia thought she was fighting to preserve control. She didn't realize she was racing toward exposure. And once environmental agencies get involved, there's no such thing as resolving things quietly anymore. Cynthia called the emergency HOA meeting with barely any notice. No proper posting, no minimum waiting period. Just an email blasted out late the night before, marked urgent, insisting attendance was strongly encouraged for all homeowners. That alone told me she was panicking. When people follow rules, they lean on procedure. When they're scared, they rush. The clubhouse was packed when I arrived. Neighbors who rarely showed up were sitting shoulder to shoulder, whispering, confused about why they'd been summoned so suddenly. Cynthia stood at the front of the room, overly polished, smiling too hard. Evan was there as well, standing off to the side, pale and stiff, clutching his phone like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Cynthia opened the meeting by thanking everyone for coming and immediately launched into a rehearsed speech. She claimed she had recently become aware of concerns regarding water quality and wanted to reassure the community that there was absolutely no danger. According to her, the HOA was proactively funding voluntary water testing as a courtesy, purely to put rumors to rest. She framed it as leadership, responsibility, transparency. It was impressive if you didn't know it was a lie. She never mentioned why the testing was suddenly necessary. She never explained why no one had been told sooner. And she very carefully avoided saying where the water came from. When she opened the floor for questions, hands shot up immediately. She ignored most of them. When someone asked why the meeting had been called without proper notice, she brushed it off as an emergency exception. When another neighbor asked whether the city had been notified, she pivoted back to her talking points. Then I stood up. The room quieted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of anything. I simply said that since water quality was now on the agenda, I had information that residents deserved to see before making any decisions. Cynthia tried to interrupt me. I kept going. I handed out copies of the lab reports. The mood shifted instantly. People leaned forward. Pages rustled. Someone near the back whispered a curse under their breath. I explained where the samples were taken, how they were collected, and why the results mattered. I explained nitrate contamination in simple terms. I explained pesticide residue. I explained bacterial growth and what it meant for anyone elderly, immunocompromised, or dealing with respiratory issues. Then Dr. Allison Park stood up. She identified herself, stated her credentials, and confirmed the reports were real, certified, and accurate. She explained, calmly and professionally, that the water being tested was not safe for consumption. She said it should never have been used as a primary source. She said continued exposure posed serious health risks. Cynthia's smile vanished. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Her hands trembled as she gripped the podium. She looked around the room, clearly realizing she was no longer in control of the narrative. That's when the doors opened. Two state environmental agents walked in, badges visible, followed by a county official. The room erupted in murmurs. One of the agents announced they were there to initiate an immediate investigation into an illegal water distribution system serving multiple homes in the development. Evans stepped forward before anyone could stop him. His voice shook, but he spoke clearly. He confirmed that his family's water usage had always been unusually low. He admitted Cynthia had instructed him to shut down discussions about permits, water, and infrastructure. He confirmed the audio recording and handed over his phone without being asked. Neighbors started talking then. One by one, about strange covers in their yards, about unexplained pipes, about pressure issues, about illnesses they brushed off for years. The agents asked questions, took notes, requested access to properties. Cynthia tried to leave. She made it 3 steps before one of the agents stopped her and asked her to remain seated. When she argued, they escorted her outside, not in handcuffs, but unmistakably no longer in charge. The woman who had terrorized neighbors over bird feeders and ramps was walked out in silence. No applause, no shouting, just stunned quiet. People sat there realizing that the HOA meetings they'd dreaded for years had just turned into the moment everything changed. As Cynthia disappeared through the doors, I looked around the room and saw something I hadn't seen in Pine Hollow Ridge in a long time. Relief. Not victory, not celebration. Relief, because the truth had finally surfaced. And once it did, there was no burying it again. The days after that meeting felt unreal, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. Within hours, state environmental crews were on site. Bright tape went up around properties. Trucks rolled in. What had once been quiet streets filled with officials carrying equipment, clipboards, and sealed containers. The so-called decorative covers were no longer decorative. They were opened, inspected, and photographed. What lay beneath confirmed everything the lab reports had warned about. The illegal wells were shut down immediately. Water lines were capped, valves were locked. Emergency notices were issued advising residents not to drink or cook with tap water until further testing could be completed. Bottled water stations were set up at the clubhouse, and for the first time since we had moved in, neighbors gathered there not to argue, but to help one another. Medical testing followed quickly. Mobile clinics arrived, offering screenings for nitrate exposure, bacterial infections, and other contamination-related risks. Some residents were angry, others were scared. A few were devastated when doctors confirmed that lingering health issues might be connected to the water they had trusted for years. Elaine was tested immediately. Sitting beside her while doctors reviewed her results was one of the hardest moments of my life. Thankfully, she had not suffered long-term damage, but the doctor was clear. Continued exposure would have been dangerous. Hearing that made my stomach turn. All I could think about was how close we had come to something irreversible. As the investigation expanded, the HOA board unraveled quickly. Members resigned one by one, some claiming ignorance, others quietly distancing themselves. Within weeks, the board formally dissolved under state supervision. What had once been an iron grip on the neighborhood vanished almost overnight. Cynthia and her husband Mark didn't disappear so quietly. Charges followed. Environmental violations, fraud, failure to disclose, abuse of authority. Civil lawsuits piled up from residents who had unknowingly consumed contaminated water. Financial penalties were assessed. Assets were frozen. The confidence Cynthia once carried like armor was gone, replaced by court dates and legal filings. For years, she had fined people for bird feeders and ramps, while something far more dangerous flowed under everyone's feet. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. The HOA's authority was placed under temporary oversight, and a neutral management firm was brought in to stabilize things. One of their first actions was to formally recognize my heated walkway as a protected medical accommodation. Not as a favor, not as an exception, as a right. That decision mattered more than Cynthia ever understood, because it sent a message, not just to me, but to everyone who had been made to feel like their needs were an inconvenience. Slowly, the neighborhood began to change. People started talking to each other again, real conversations. Honest ones. Neighbors who had avoided meetings for years showed up to rebuild something better. Walter put his bird feeders back up. Maria installed a permanent, code-compliant ramp with community support. The Reynolds family stopped hiding their therapy equipment. No one was counting violations anymore. They were counting on each other. Trust doesn't return overnight. Fear leaves scars. But something powerful happens when people realize the rules were never meant to protect them and that they don't have to live that way anymore. I noticed it in small moments. Someone offering to shovel a driveway without being asked. A neighbor checking in on Elaine after appointments. Laughter at the mailbox where silence once lived. The same streets that had felt cold and hostile began to feel like a community again, and every time snow fell, the heated walkway did exactly what it was designed to do. It kept Elaine safe. It gave her independence. It gave us peace. Looking back, I understand now why Cynthia fought so hard over something that should never have mattered to her. It wasn't about rules or appearances. It was about control. The moment people stopped being afraid, her power disappeared. The wells were gone. The lies were exposed. The intimidation had failed. What remained was accountability, and a neighborhood that finally understood its own strength. For the first time since we moved to Pine Hollow Ridge, no one whispered when the HOA was mentioned. They spoke openly, and that silence she once relied on? It was gone for good. Months later, winter returned to Pine Hollow Ridge. Snow drifted down quietly this time, soft and steady, covering the neighborhood in white. I stood at our front window and watched it melt cleanly off the heated walkway, just as it was designed to do. No ice, no danger, no fear. Behind me, Elenius moved easily with her walker, breathing steadily, no longer treated like a problem that needed to be corrected. What happened to Cynthia wasn't about someone shouting louder or fighting dirtier. She fell because she underestimated systems. She underestimated paperwork, documentation, and the kind of truth that survives daylight. She believed authority came from a title and that silence could be enforced forever. But titles don't hold up under investigation, and fear doesn't last once people start asking questions. HOAs thrive when no one speaks. Bullies thrive when everyone looks away. But truth doesn't care about who runs the board. Truth shows up as lab reports, as permits pulled from dusty archives, as inspectors and investigators who don't answer to neighborhood presidents or emergency meetings called in panic. If you're being targeted, write everything down. Save every email. Photograph every notice. Track the patterns, because patterns don't lie. If rules suddenly change, ask who benefits. If questions make someone nervous, pay attention. And if someone in power panics when you ask about basic things like water, permits, or money, that panic is your proof that something is wrong. Our neighborhood didn't need stricter rules. It needed honesty, accountability, and the courage to stop being afraid. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?